Hello, everyone. Welcome to our WISA IV-E Women in Student Affairs webinar this month. We are going to be discussing moving in, through, and out your first job experience. And so we are going to give people a few moments to log in and connect with us. And so we will be starting momentarily. Okay, well, we are going to get going. So again, welcome. My name is Ebony Turnbow, and I am the 4 East WISA Women in Student Affairs, KC representative for our region. And I would like to just welcome you all for being here with our webinar today. We have some amazing panelists, and we've been working really hard to bring a topic to you that focuses on the job experience as well as navigating that process and what it looks like as a new professional. And so please feel free to engage with us. I'm excited to have you. And as we get through this webinar, we will be discussing at the end some of the other opportunities that we have as a KC that we can connect you with and let you know some other things that we have coming up. Right now, though, I want to introduce one of our leadership team members on our KC. Jordan is the chair of this particular webinar, and she has been working extremely hard. And so I'm really excited to allow her to facilitate and moderate this webinar for our panelists today. And so right now I'm going to turn it over to Jordan Hughes to kick us off. Jordan?
Okay, perfect. Everybody can hear me okay? Great. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I'm so excited that we're doing a webinar again this year. I think this is a really good format to have some really good open and honest dialogue about the process of getting your first job and navigating your first job and then moving on to your second role and just navigating that entire transition process. And so in thinking about how we wanted to craft this conversation, we were really intentional about recruiting women from a variety of institutions who've worked in a variety of different geographic regions and have also held roles in a variety of different functional areas within higher ed and student affairs. So we're really excited to introduce our 3 panelists today. So first on the panel, we have Allison Burke, and Allison is the Assistant Director of Greek Affairs at University of Rhode Island. And then we also have April Hobby, who is the Associate Director of Alumni Outreach at American University in DC. And then Courtney Smith, who is the Associate Director for the Sun Devil Fitness Complex at Arizona State University. And you'll get to hear a little bit more about them and their backgrounds. And they're super excited to talk to you about this topic. And they've put in a lot of work and thought into preparing answers to some commonly asked questions. And thank you to those of you who did submit questions as well. They were awesome and was really impressed with the content of some of the questions. And we will definitely try our best to get to as many of those as possible at the end of the webinar. But I'm going to first start out by asking our panelists some questions targeted around job search and interview strategies. I know that's especially timely right now, given that the recruiting process may be starting for those of you that are still in your grad programs, or some of us may be looking to pivot into new roles at our current institutions. So my first question is, all of you have participated in national job searches at some point. Can you share some highlights and some lowlights from that process?
I can start on that one. So hi again, I'm Allison. So I was previously at Arizona State University for about 3 years and participated in national job search. My role at ASU was in fraternity and sorority life, and I ended up here at URI in a position in fraternity and sorority life. as well. So made the big jump. I'm from the Northeast originally. So for me, it was transitioning back to home, but it can be really daunting kind of looking at other universities and looking at places that maybe you don't know the culture of the institution. You don't really know how some of the things are set up there. So definitely recommend doing some research about the culture of an office or culture of the community, learning a little bit more about that as you explore some of your options. I also, as I was in my job search, applied to positions outside of Greek life that I was looking for other opportunities as well. So make sure that you also maybe, as you're looking in the process, what are other opportunities in other divisions, either in student affairs or even outside of student affairs, to kind of dip your feet in there. Sometimes it may be difficult that you may not get through that initial screening if you've been working in one position for a certain period of time, but be comfortable and be okay applying to positions maybe outside of your typical function area so that you get that really good experience.
I think to add to like what Allison just mentioned, for me, I previously was at Arizona State University in our ASU Alumni Association, went to grad school there. So I was there for quite some time. And so for me, I wanted to find a place where it would challenge me. I felt like I've done almost everything I could within that role. And so I was like, okay, what else is there? Like, what's next? And so I looked at Chicago, looked at DC, looked at some other areas because I'm from Southern California. So for me, this national search was more so of like, okay, I'm actually going to be challenging myself to move somewhere different, going to a different type of institution. So I went from a public to private, but trying to figure out, you know, what is the right institution for me. So I think that was the interesting part of the process, is just learning the differences of the institutions you interview at, or even just searching. So yeah, you'll definitely learn things through the process, and you'll learn about yourself more in that.
Yeah, and just to add to that a little bit, I've had some of the similar experiences. So I, out of grad school, did a very national search and was very open to anywhere and everything in a lot of different functional areas and a lot of different locations geographically. So I've since done a few different types of searches, some national and some very focused geographically. And so I think to the other two panelists' points, you have to know what you want, and a lot of different possibilities are out there if you're more open to location and if you're more open to functional areas. Even if it's your first role and you know for sure that you want to do something else long term, being open to some of those more unique or different options on the first time around is a really good thing. The first time around can be really overwhelming. So I think we'll get into some of those things where you can have some tips on how to stay organized and how to not overwhelm yourself, but know that it's overwhelming for everybody, and that's okay. That's just part of it the first time.
Great, thank you so much for those thoughtful answers. So continuing along on this topic of job searching, can you all can you speak to a little bit how you started your job search process? I know sometimes it's overwhelming, especially for those of us that maybe are open to like multiple regions and multiple functions. So can you talk about where you started your search process, and were there any specific tools or systems that you used to kind of structure yourself and help you get organized?
I can start for that one. So like I said, the first time I searched nationally, I was coming out of grad school, and I lived in Miami at the time. I went to the University of Miami for grad school and worked there. And coming out of that, I really was quite open to different functional specialties because I had done my practicum in a few different areas and worked in a different area. And I was also super open location-wide, which meant that really every job once I got to TPE was a possibility if it was an entry-level job. And so that was a very overwhelming feeling. I kind of turned a little nerdy and went Excel sheet with how to organize a lot of my thoughts. And it worked out really well for me. But I think the key to that is knowing what works for you and how you can best stay organized in that process, because there are so many possibilities, especially this time of year. I think with that, knowing what you want out of your first position, if you know that it's just going to be a learning experience for you and you're open to learning about what you want, then be very open-minded and be willing to go to different places. If you know that you're very focused on one geographic location or one functional area that you really want to gain experience in, then know that that's what you're looking for, so you can really tailor your search to not drive yourself crazy and to not get so overwhelmed, but really only look at the ones that you think you will be happy in and that you think will move you further in your career.
Absolutely. I would 100% echo the Google Doc or Excel sheet to track your application process. That definitely helped me, especially as I was applying to positions not in one functional area. So making sure you track what the job title is. I also put a section on there if it listed the pay. So I would kind of know as I was going into, if I was going in for an interview or if I had a phone interview, kind of where I was at there. Other resources that I felt are good to use, higher ed jobs will obviously have plenty of resources and positions posted on there, but not all universities utilize that or post positions through higher ed jobs. Some other really good tools that I used were joining different Facebook groups, like a lot of the NASPA knowledge community groups. Lots of people will post jobs there as well. I think that's actually where I found my current position, was someone posted it in a Facebook group, and I was able to find it that way. If you're involved in any professional associations, they typically will have job postings on there as well. Again, I work in fraternity and sorority life. Our professional association is the Association of Fraternity and Sorority Advisors. So they post positions on there as well that, again, may not go to higher ed jobs or may not find its way to a Facebook group, especially if it's a position that they're maybe turning around really quickly and only have open for a 2-week window. So there are a number of resources you can use there to kind of help you find other positions and not just relying solely on higher ed jobs as well. If there's an institution you specifically want to work at, you can look directly on that institution's website too and see what positions that they have posted as well. Again, sometimes with those, the turnaround time might be 2 weeks, so you may just catch it at the right time that you found a position. So definitely use that as a resource. The Google Doc Excel sheet was absolutely so necessary, especially in figuring out timeline, when to follow up on emails to folks if you haven't heard back in some time as well.
Great, thank you. Were there any ways that you felt your gender identity in particular affected your navigation during the job search process? I know that imposter syndrome is a very salient real thing for a lot of people as they're navigating this search. So can any of you kind of speak to that and how that came into play?
Yeah, I can talk about it. So my previous position, I was a coordinator senior at my previous institution. And so when I was ready to, I felt I was ready to kind of make that jump, I kind of had to determine, is it being assistant director like the natural next step, or is it an associate director? And so I kind of struggled in the beginning, be like, okay, should I just only apply for these certain type of jobs? But then finally at one point I was like, I feel like I'm very qualified for these positions. So I'm going to challenge myself to apply for, these associate director positions. And so through that process, I kind of got to learn more about myself and challenge myself. But then I also had mentors that, I had, practice interviews, and we just kind of had little pep talks and saying, how do you envision what an associate director looks like? And how do you display that? And so through that kind of helps me even going through the interview process of being really prepared in the sense of having even additional things to show my work, which I thought was really cool for myself. But I think a lot of times our imposter syndrome is always, it comes from us or even looking at others. And so I think just knowing that you are the best person for that job and you just have to show them why.
Great. That's perfect. Kind of in the same token, the search process, and you both have all of you have kind of touched on this a little bit already, but the search process can be really competitive, especially if you're in a grad program and maybe, you're struggling to get interviews and your peers are getting jobs and accepting them. So can you kind of touch on the emotionally exhausting component of this and how to take care of yourself during this process?
I can also answer that one. I think for me during the process, I first kind of figured out, okay, what are my ideal cities that I want to live in? So that kind of helped me look at which regions of the country I'm like, I will probably never want to move to or work in. So that kind of helped with, you know, charting down, like, okay, these are the schools that I can look at. But through the process, you know, you have moments where you're just like, okay, like this is not working out. So it's okay to take pauses in your job search process. I know I took a 2-week break from applying because it just seemed like something wasn't working. So I kind of had to like re-strategize and figure out, you know, is it my resume? Is it my cover letter? Am I not doing the keywords? So just sitting down and just taking time to just sit back and just reassess, and that's completely fine. Because I know for everyone, it's a different process when you apply for jobs. Some people can find something instantly. Some may take a few more extra months, and that's completely fine. It's a process. But for me, it was just, you know, sitting back and just reassuring, like, okay, maybe this region might not be the best, or this institution might not be the best, and that's okay. But obviously, I recognize too that I'm very fortunate that I didn't necessarily have restrictions in terms of the geographic locations, in terms of like I have to be in just this region. So I'm fortunate for that part, but I also recognize that that's not likely for everyone when they're looking for positions. And I think to talk about peers, I think people have their different times for when they'll be in, you know, whatever position it might be. So if someone gets a position as a director and you're like, well, like, I wish I could be in that role, I always think it's just not my time, or it's, you know, for vice versa, it's not their time. But I think when the time is right, it will happen. I just think keep working at it and it will come.
Perfect. Courtney, you're going to talk to me.
Yeah. Did you want me to add a little bit? That's okay. So I can add a little bit more specifically from the TPE experience, which I know is coming up very soon. If anyone here is going to TPE, I know that's next week. And it can be a really exciting time, but it can also be very stressful. So as April hinted at a little bit, you're in the same space with your peers who are getting interviews, and you may or may not be as many as they are. And so really can't stress enough what April had said about taking time and being patient in that process is really, really important. Probably my biggest tip, I've done TPE twice now. Once with, like I said before, a very national, very wide open search, and then once where I was very, very geographically focused. And both were very different experiences. And I think no matter what, a key piece to remember when you're in TPE and kind of the excitement and the craziness of it all is that don't stray from who you are as a professional, and don't stray from who you are as just a regular person as well. If you are someone that wakes up super early every morning and eats the same thing for breakfast every morning and has your morning routine, don't pick TPE as the time to change all of that. Even as you're traveling, try and keep most true to yourself as you possibly can, because that's going to give you the confidence to go into how many interviews you have that day. And it can get really exhausting doing that. So if you're taking care of yourself in that way and staying true to what you usually do as best you can as you're traveling, it's very, very helpful and will only help your interviews be really successful. I think to April's point too about having patience and kind of giving yourself that time, as everyone who's going to TPE or even in the interview process in general right now will find out, there's a lot of times when you have to schedule things very close together and you're getting thrown a whole lot of things at once, whether it's from these new potential possibilities in your life or your current job. And if you're giving yourself that time and really scheduling time for yourself to take care of yourself and to really make sure that your self-care is in check, and B, take time between interviews or between things that you have to do to allow yourself to prepare for the next thing. I know at TPE that can be really hard because you're trying to schedule 12 interviews in a day or something crazy like that, but giving yourself that time between will really give you the confidence going into the next interview, whether it's 5 extra minutes to look up some research on the institution or 5 extra minutes to connect with somebody, really allows yourself to be more confident going into your next step. So I really, really stress taking the time for yourself and to collect your thoughts between things during that time.
Okay, great. That was really, really good advice. So after TPE and after you start applying to roles, obviously networking and the interview process is kind of the next big step. And as we all know, networking is a really critical component of that process, and navigating it, especially for the first time, can be pretty challenging. And there are some unwritten, do's and don'ts, and each institution's culture is very different. So I'm wondering if you can speak to any like specific tips and advice around networking, and maybe some skills you used or strategies you utilized to like, get your foot in the door and get interviews.
I can talk about that one a little bit. So Jordan, you're absolutely right. Like networking is so key, especially in this field. It's a lot about who you know, because that will actually help you secure interviews, secure those networking opportunities. It's really is about who you know. I was able to, with my supervisor, when I told them I was applying for positions, I was actually through my network was able to connect with someone who had a position previous at that institution that I was applying to, not the position that I ended up taking. So I was able to schedule an informational interview with that person about their previous experience there, what they liked about the student population, what they liked about the department, and gave me a really good lens that I probably wouldn't have gotten just from going on the interview. And it helped me make a decision about if I wanted to work there or not. Again, we talked a lot about an institutional fit and finding a position that's the right fit for you. And so don't be afraid to use your connections to be able to talk with someone that is maybe was an undergraduate student there, maybe did their grad program there, previously worked there, or someone who works in a different department that maybe interacts there. That way you'll get a good idea of kind of the culture of the institution. You may get some insight that you maybe normally wouldn't in an interview process that can help you make a good decision about working there. So I definitely recommend as you start to go to conferences. I know we've got a lot of conferences coming up in the next couple weeks, especially with NASPA. Make connections there, absolutely, and follow up. Don't be afraid to just shoot them an email and say, hey, it was so great to meet you at this session, or when you're in a breakout session, take time to talk to the person sitting next to you, because they may be a good resource for you as you're thinking about the job search.
I think that's a really good point, and something also just popped into my head that I wanted to share that I feel like has been really helpful for me is when you meet people at these conferences and you talk to them and you have a good conversation. You should follow up with an email and acknowledge that, but also just like friending them on LinkedIn, I think is really important. I think especially as you get like further and further into your career, you're going to meet so many people and it's really hard to keep track of them. And then you may want to work at an institution, and you just search that institution in your LinkedIn and you find that like, oh, I met this person already and I connected with them at NASPA a few years ago, or at like a NASPA regional conference. And I think there have been a couple times where that has like worked out in my favor. And I think, so that's just like one really small tip after you get home, is not to just like throw all the business cards in a drawer, but to literally just go on LinkedIn and like make sure you're at least keeping track of who you're meeting, especially because if you meet that person again, you don't want to reintroduce yourself if they recognize you, or if you've already met them. That's always embarrassing. But okay, yeah, that was good advice. Courtney, you were going to touch on some specific strategies for TPE participants, right?
Yeah. So I think there's a few things that I think, besides knowing your employer, I think that's kind of the obvious advice that you're given, right? Know who you're interviewing with, know about the position that you're shooting for, and I think that goes for really whether you're at TPE or applying for any other role later in the game. Obviously, you need to know what you're interviewing for. So I think those are some of the basics that everyone knows, but I think there's also just some things to consider that as you're traveling to TPE, maybe things that you don't think about beforehand. A couple that I thought of was dressing what you feel comfortable and confident in. A lot of people, when they go to TPE for the first time, think that they need to have their best suit and their best outfit and be trendy and all these things. And it's really not about that. It's about being confident in what you are wearing and what you look like. And so I think if you are exuding that confidence in the space that you are in, employers notice those kinds of things regardless of what jacket you're wearing or whatever. So yes, you need to dress professionally, but wear what makes you feel confident, because that's very obvious to employers. And then another thing that I thought of too, which I think most people wouldn't hint at, is make sure that you're taking time during the interview process to turn yourself off at some point during the day, especially in TPE. You have to be on at all times. And if no one has shared that yet, that is true. You will run into people everywhere throughout the city. Even this year in LA, it's a huge place, but everyone is staying in the same quarters. Everyone's staying in that same little area. And so you will run into people that you're interviewing with outside of the interview setting. And so you do have to be very mindful and be kind of on at all times and be ready to talk with people. But it's really helpful, especially if you're more of an introverted person, to give yourself that time to go and just kind of turn off in your room and reset for the next day or the next thing that you have to do. It's really gonna free up your mind and free up yourself to be ready for that next step, whatever that may be for you, even if it's traveling home. But really just allow yourself that time to do that. And then I know we've mentioned it already, but especially April and Allison, but just staying organized even throughout the process as you're at TPE and gathering information and gathering cards and getting invited to socials and all these exciting things. It's all great. But if you're just kind of a jumbling mess of all these things, you're going to lose track of it because it is a lot to take in all in a very short amount of time. So even throughout the process, make sure that you're continuing to stay organized from the start to the finish, because that's super important.
Perfect. So you interview, you go through TPE, you successfully get a job, and you're about to start your first role post-masters for most of us. Can you three, if you could share just like a short and sweet single piece of advice that you wish you knew before you started your first job? Like, what do you think is the most important thing to know before you step foot in the building, I guess?
I'll go first. I naturally am the person that's kind of like hit the ground running. Like you just want to start and do everything. But what I've learned is you actually need to do the opposite, is just sit back and actually just absorb everything, not just like, what your current department's doing, but learning what they've done in the past, who they've partnered with, and how can we do this in the future in terms of new partnerships. So I think just sitting back, and then eventually you can hit the ground running.
Definitely agree. I think in my job now, I definitely spent about 6 months doing that. So I'm very thankful that I've been able to take my previous advice of like, sit back and relax and kind of see that. I would say a good piece of advice there is, I think goes back with the networking, is that even when you start a new job, always networking with new folks at your current institution and outside, because you never know when other opportunities. So as soon as you get into a new position, don't just think like, okay, I've got it, I'm done, hooray. But you're always networking, you're always meeting new people. So always have that on the forefront of your mind, whether you're in the job search or you've started a new position.
Those are both great. I couldn't agree more with those two things. I think in addition, just realizing the culture that you're in at your institution, and that kind of goes along with just getting to know your space, not diving in on day one, but actually getting to know what's going on around you, and also knowing what you want to get out of that position. So your first role is likely not going to be the end-all be-all role that you keep forever. That happens very, very infrequently. And so knowing what you want to learn from it, what you want to gain from that, so that you can continue to grow in that way, no matter what the role is.
Perfect. Okay. In the interest of time, I'm going to kind of combine the next two questions presenters, just an FYI. So the first question was kind of about navigating the transition from being a grad student to being a full-time professional. And I know Courtney was gonna touch on that a little bit. And then I guess embedded in that is kind of transitioning to this, like, for a lot of student affairs professionals, especially in their first role, burnout and stress and kind of the expectation that you're like available at all hours all the time is kind of an unwritten rule and just like an expectation. And so Allison, I know you were going to touch on that a little bit too from your experience. Courtney, let's hear a little bit first about the transition to post-grad life.
Sure. And I think all I was really going to touch on there, nothing too extensive, but the importance of having a life outside of your professional position. When you first come out of grad school, it's such a natural reaction to just dive in and consume yourself and your role, which is great to a certain extent. If you find yourself living in a new place or living in a new role, and you've been there for a year and all you have is that role, how do you take care of yourself? How do you really grow yourself as a person and get involved in things outside of the institution, or just at least outside of your role? I think that can come in a variety of ways, whether it's getting involved in something in the community, or just finding yourself a hobby. If all of a sudden you take up running and that's what you do for your self-care time and your you time to get your mind off of work and de-stress, then that's fantastic. That doesn't mean that you have to go and join a running club, but that's your you time. That's something that you're doing for yourself that really doesn't have anything to do with your professional role. So I think finding your thing that you can kind of have that's separate from work is really important as a young professional, just to give yourself that little bit of balance. I don't think anyone is gonna disagree or say that their work-life balance is spot on, because for most student affair professionals, it's not, and that's okay. But as long as you're being mindful of it, and making that effort to do something to give yourself some balance is really good.
Yeah, absolutely. On the burnout, I think in the student affairs profession, we are working in a lot of the times really student-facing roles, and sometimes we're here late at nights or early in the morning and on the weekends. I know that when I jumped into my first profession, I didn't even think about me time. I was like, I'm so excited to have a position. I'm so excited to get involved in this. And didn't set boundaries with students, especially about, hey, you can call me anytime or text me or email me. And I would sometimes bring my laptop home and be doing work at 8, 9 o'clock at night, or replying to emails that I didn't get to during the day if I was meeting with students. So I think as I transitioned into this new position, I really wanted to make sure to set boundaries of, I'm not going to send emails after 8 o'clock at night, and I'm not going to find it okay for folks to call me or text me after 8 o'clock, unless it's something that's like an emergency. But just making sure you set those boundaries with your, if you supervise a grad assistant, if you have a supervisor, if you work with a group of students, setting those boundaries and say like, hey, this is after 8 o'clock, like it's my time, please don't call me, or whatever time that might be for you, that you want to kind of shut down the computer and be on your own time. Because if you don't set that up, you're going to be burnt out, and you'll be replying to phone calls and emails late at night when you really need to focus on yourself, especially too with not just students, but with a supervisor saying, hey, like, unless it's an emergency, don't call me. We can meet tomorrow, and setting that up so that you have that relationship with your supervisor too.
Yeah, and that's hard to do. I feel like that takes a bit of time to like work out and kind of like build that rapport with your boss or with students too. But it's really good advice. Okay, so in terms of being in your first role, and you've been in your first role for X amount of years, a lot of questions, and we actually got a couple of questions submitted beforehand on this topic too, so I'm glad that we're covering it here, is when did you know it was time to move on from your first role? Like, what were some of the internal like gut check things going on that were letting you know maybe it was time to start looking for your second job?
I can answer that. For me, my position as a coordinator senior, the shelf life was about a year. And so for my supervisor, once it hit kind of that year mark, they were just like, okay, if you want to leave, that's completely fine, because that's just kind of what the set expectation is. But also recognize, I think for a lot of many institutions, there's certain positions that just have a shelf life. And so it might just be natural that they're like, oh, like, are you interested? But for me, I felt like that job gave me so much experience that I felt like I needed to stay in it a little bit longer, so that I feel like I was prepared to take on a new role, that I felt like I got everything I needed in my previous position. So for me, I think it was probably doing one last commencement ceremony, and it was just like one of the best ones, and just like seeing the students and all the partnerships that we had with some of our external units. I think for me, that was a signal like I've achieved everything that I wanted in that position. And I felt like at that point, it only made sense for me to see, you know, what does this look like for me at a different institution? And then also, you know, we eventually like to get paid a little bit more. So that was also great. But for me, yeah, it's just kind of, I knew it was time. I also graduated at that point 2 years out from graduate school. So I knew for me being in that role, it was just kind of, I knew for myself it was time. And so I just kind of started that journey of just searching. So.
And I think for me, a lot of similarity there, but I think in one of my roles, I kind of realized that there was just more and more being added, which is also very trendy to do in student affairs, right? You have a role and then you have other duties as assigned, which is great. It gives you a great diverse experience most of the time, but when that is never ending and you can't really gain that regularity in your role of really owning your position because there's just always something being added, I think that's kind of just saying, okay, I think I'm ready for something new, and being open with your supervisor about some of those things of is this ever going to change, or are there always going to be new things added? Because if that is the case, then okay, that's the natural way of that role. And if that's not what you want to do forever and you want to continue doing, then it is time to look. And looking can be a long process. So being open about those kinds of things with coworkers or supervisors is perfectly acceptable.
Yeah, I think another thing I just thought of too that I would add there is about how long the process can be, just looking for the right second role. I myself just started my second role 3 weeks ago, and I had been looking at a bunch of different opportunities, and there were some that I said no to, there were some that I applied to, and then I went through the interview process and I realized oh, this would not be a good next step. And I think it is really important to be intentional about the path that you want your career to take. I mean, no job has to be the end all be all, but I do think reflecting on what you liked and you didn't like about that first role, and then making sure there's hopefully more of what you like and less of what you didn't like in that second role is also super important too, because those decisions will take you on a path, and you can of course divert, and careers are not linear by any means anymore, but I do think it's important to just pause and reflect on that first job and move forward from there. So Courtney, I know you have a specific story we were going to touch on about how do you broach that conversation with your boss? So when you realize that you're ready for a new role, April, you talked about leaving on a good note and feeling like you've accomplished all you wanted to. When is it appropriate to start having that conversation, and then how did you do that?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the most important things to remember is that you have to have that good conversation, or that good relationship rather, with your supervisor before you get to that point is the most ideal situation. And so if you're just starting a position now, or you're relatively new in a position, whether it's your first or second role or you're in grad school, continue to build that relationship so that it's not this uncomfortable elephant in the room when you are starting to look for something new. Because remembering that it's a very natural process to be ready to move on at some juncture, or to be presented with a great opportunity at some juncture. And if you have that good relationship already with your supervisor, and you get a fantastic opportunity, they're not going to be mad at you for doing that. They're going to be proud of you. So establishing that relationship early on can be super helpful when it comes time to move on to your next thing. For my specific instance, it could be something that other people are going through, so I'll share a little bit about it. When I was a grad student, I had kind of an interim role because there was a lot of movement in my department at the time. And so when it came time right around my graduation, when I was looking for my first professional role, the position that I was in at the time actually became available. So I was an internal candidate for a process that was kind of happening right around me. So definitely a lot of awkward kind of implications with that. And I was being interviewed by students and staff that I was already supervising or working alongside. So that can be a really high pressure situation. I would say it's much harder to interview with people that you're very close with already than people that you've never met before. So definitely some uniqueness is there, but I think I could have done a lot of things better in that process, and just being super transparent with my supervisor at the time would have helped a lot. And I think moving forward from that, in the situations when I've pursued new roles or gotten new opportunities since then, the more open I've been with my supervisor, the easier the process has been. It's not really fun for anyone to feel very secretive when they're at work or trying to hide phone calls that they're getting or anything like that. And I've seen people try and do that, and it's not enjoyable. It just makes the whole process a lot more stressful. So I would say the earlier you can tell your supervisor that you are beginning to look or that you have been approached about a new opportunity, the better. Again, if it's just that first conversation with someone or you just saw a job posting, you may not need to tell them at that point. But if you're starting to interview and you're going to want to use them as a reference and those sorts of things, it is time to have that conversation and just be very transparent about it. And if I think with that level of transparency, it'll serve you really well.
Sorry, my mic was muted. I said I completely second all of that. Okay, so in terms of the skills that you need to develop in your first role, are there any skills that you think are like completely essential and particularly important to develop in that first job? And then how did this influence your career planning process?
I think that we've hit on networking a lot, but I would say that's the number one skill, especially as you move into a new role, and then you're going to need to utilize support, especially in student affairs, from other divisions as you work with directly with students or with student organizations or different pockets of students. That networking is going to be so crucial. So whether it's at conferences, whether it's in staff meetings, whether it's through professional associations, I think the number one resource is being able to network and have a group of folks that you can be able to utilize to have. And whether it's when you start career planning or if you just need help with something else, that's going to be the number one, I think the number one tool that you're going to have. And I think that'll help you boost confidence in having conversations. It'll help you understand what are other things going on in different departments to kind of compare what's going on, whether in your own department or at other institutions. But I would absolutely say that having those networking skills and being confident to approach someone or talk to them at a conference or in your own division and getting involved is going to be number one, especially as you think about career planning.
Perfect. Okay. So we are going to move on to taking questions from you all. So what we're going to do first is we got a really good long list of questions from everyone in advance, which was great. Thank you all so much for those of you who submitted them. I'm going to read a couple from this list, and then I will go over to the YouTube chat and just see if anybody has any questions that have just like come up organically throughout this conversation. So here is the first question, and panelists, just for your reference, this is like the first one in blue on our sheet. So this attendee says, I love my first job. It is truly my dream job, but I need to make more money. And they've been at the institution for several years, and they're concerned about the ability to move up because of the financial situation at the university, which is definitely like a common problem across higher ed, is, you know, limited amount of funding for raises or merit increase. This person says they're worried about navigating politics and losing student contacts. And they're also limited geographically. So they're trying to basically get some advice on what to do when you're having some difficulty moving up, either because of like financial situation at your institution or being limited geographically, and just feeling like a little bit stuck in what to do when you're kind of in that situation.
I can start if you want. I have been in a similar position. It was not my first job out of grad school, but my second, and I had been there for almost 2 years, and several of my coworkers had left, and I had taken on a lot more responsibility. So same kind of thing. I really felt like I needed a move in pay and a move in position, and I wasn't quite sure what to do. It's definitely a difficult conversation to have with a supervisor, asking for pay. For me, that was something that was not comfortable at all. but it's a very frank and transparent conversation that needs to happen. I will say, being on the flip side of it, when I've had conversations with now people that I supervise, it's almost like this elephant in the room has been addressed, because it's so natural. Everyone wants to make more, right? Especially in student affairs. Like, you're always going to be looking for that next position, or looking for, you know, if there is a potential for merit raise, or if there's a potential for a title change. And I think with being in that position, I believe the attendee said for 3 years, if you haven't asked for it, I would bet that your supervisor almost expects that conversation to come at some point in the near future. Because it's such a natural thing to want that. So I would say having that conversation, laying out the things that you've accomplished, the things that you've done in that role, showing some of your successes or your growing points as kind of basis for, look at what I've done, and I think I should be awarded or deserve some kind of reward for that, is a super fair conversation to have.
I think I can add to that. I think the other part that I think about too is when we're looking at different types of institutions, I think people forget about community colleges. They're also a great option as well to look into. Sometimes they pay more, just a little bit more. But I think for me, when I was going through my process, I recognized within our structure previously, most of the people before me, or that are in that next step from coordinator to manager, they've been in their role for 5 to 10 years. And so for me, there was just kind of a point where I was like, okay, like, I don't necessarily want to have to wait 5 or 10 years to actually get what I want. And so that's also kind of like a privilege within itself, being that I could look elsewhere. But I had to kind of determine, like, you know, do I really want to do another 5 to 10 years? So I started looking elsewhere. But I think within that too, is looking at other institutions. How much are they paying people in the same role as you? Because I think that can also be a way that you can negotiate. Is like, okay, this institution, they're doing the same exact thing, same function, and they're paying this amount. And I think even if you interview for a different institution and you get an offer, you can be like, hey, if you really like the institution that you're at, you can actually use that as a negotiation of like, hey, they're offering me this. Would you be willing to meet me there? So I think there's different ways that you can angle it. But yeah, it's definitely a lot of researching, because in my current role, it wasn't posted my salary. So what I had to do is call HR just to even ask, like, what is the starting, so that I could have a good idea. Because a lot of times you'll see commensurate with experience, or like they won't list it at all. So don't hesitate to call HR just to even know what that's starting, or even what the end is. Preferably go for the starting, because you'll have a better idea.
I will say that if you're going to do putting an offer out in front of your boss, or putting an offer out from another, if you're kind of using offers against each other, which is definitely you should do that if you have 2 offers. Absolutely. I think your boss should be aware that you're interviewing. So you don't want to just completely blindside them with I have this other offer. They're going to, pay me this much, take it or leave it. Kind of you want to make sure that you are in a good situation at work, and that your supervisor knows you're looking, and that the conversation should feel hey, this is something that came up, it's an opportunity, and this is how much they're doing. Do you think there's any wiggle room on maybe regrading my position, or could this be something we talk about during annual review time during the year? So I think making that conversation feel if you want to stay at your institution or in your current job. If you don't, then take the other job. But I do think it's important to be hopefully having, Courtney was talking about this too, making sure that it's natural, and that you hopefully have a good rapport with your boss, and that they should be your champion for your next activities. And I feel that usually comes after having done a good job in the role, and accomplishing a good amount, and it feeling a very natural time for both parties, for that employee to start looking for a growth opportunity. And a good manager will want to be a partner and an ally for you in that process too. Okay, great. So I'm gonna ask one of the questions that somebody actually just submitted now on the YouTube chat, and then I'll kind of toggle back and forth depending on how much time we have with those questions that were submitted on Google Forms. Let's see. So there's two questions. I'm going to ask this one because I think this is also important, and I think some of us can speak to this as well. But did any of you have to navigate the two-body problem with a partner looking for jobs as well? I can speak to this, but I know that I'm sure the panelists can too. So does anybody want to speak to that? Because I feel like that's a very real part. Allison's like, hi.
Yes, very real. So my partner and I, he lived in Kentucky while I lived in Arizona, and we were looking to move in together. So we were both navigating the job search. So yeah, it's definitely really tough. I think one of the things that we needed to do was pick one location that we wanted to go to. So we had a couple different locations that we were okay moving to. But for a lot of people, you may have a partner in one location and you need to get to that location. So yeah, definitely difficult. I think I even, like I've shared earlier, I've explored other functional areas inside student affairs, but also sometimes it's okay to maybe look outside. Working directly at an institution, there's lots of opportunities to work with students outside of the traditional collegiate role. So again, and making sure you're transparent with your partner. If you're both okay moving to one location, or if you're picking up and moving there, I think being transparent about the timeline of things as well. As I was searching it, I was really transparent, said that, hey, if I don't find anything by July, I'm going to have to stay in this current role and I can't move to where we want to go. And sometimes that's a really difficult and uncomfortable conversation that you sometimes have to have. So just knowing that, again, there's probably going to be some conversations around that, and making sure that you both are on the same page in the search there as well. And not assuming that one person would go to one part of the country when maybe they don't want to go and you want to go to this place. So being really transparent about where you're comfortable moving to, and knowing all your options in different kinds of positions, for sure.
Yeah, I echo everything she just said. I will say that so actually, how I met all of these three women in some way, shape, or form was working and going to grad school at Arizona State University. And I'm from Chicago, and I was dead set, heels in the sand, staying in Chicago. And my husband got a job in Arizona, and I kind of went kicking and screaming, and it turned out to be the best experience ever. And I'm very grateful for it. So I will say sometimes the universe will pull you in a direction or pull you towards a position, and you may not see why, or it may not seem like the best thing on paper at the moment, and it can turn out to be a very fantastic experience if you are open to it and really delve in at the institution and try to build relationships with colleagues and join staff associations. So but I guess before we had that conversation, there were definitely certain areas of the country. Allison, you touched on this too, but there were certain areas of the country, and April, I think you did too, certain institutions that I was okay working at, and certain areas that we both of us just were not interested in living in. I think also if you have maybe know some family there, sometimes that's nice, or if you're vaguely familiar with the city. But sometimes if you're adventurous and you just want to go totally experience somewhere new together, that's okay. My husband and I didn't know anybody in Arizona, and it worked out okay, but it is a really tough transition, especially if you're both going somewhere new. So that's a very real thing a lot of people have to navigate. So I empathize with you, and I understand the trickiness of both people searching. So I'm going to ask another question on the side here, because I want to just touch on the things that people who are here are asking. So this person says, as a new professional, they've been full-time employee for 2 years and just finished their master's in May. Do you have guidance on shifting into an area of higher ed that's different from your grad assistantship or your current area of experience? So this person is wanting to work in an area that's completely functionally different, it sounds, than what they did their GA in. So panelists, do you have any advice for that, kind of along the lines of transferable skills or things that are kind of common to speak to, I guess, across higher ed?
I can start with that one because I did something very similar. I've done a couple of functional shifts during my time now after grad school. I had very, very limited contact within our housing department in grad school, and then my first professional role was as a resident director in housing, and that was very unique and very different. Obviously, that's kind of a common switch because a lot of people start their careers in housing, but I think transferable skills, especially during the interview process, you essentially know the key things that they're going to want you to talk about. So what I did during the interview process, and I've done this a couple times since then, is they're going to comment on something with conflict resolution or with problem solving or with leadership experience. And so making a list of those things that for sure interviewers are going to hit on, and thinking of several examples within your current workspace or within your current experience to comment on those things, because employers are looking for examples of those things, and have those ready to go is super helpful in making you feel confident. So even if they do kind of throw you a curveball, you've already answered the other 5 questions about these key skills really well. So from an interview standpoint, I think that would be my suggestion, to think of examples of those skills. And then switching from one functional area to another, being okay with a learning process, I think would be my biggest tip. I didn't experience it as much in housing, but in one of my more current switches, I switched over to campus recreation, which is somewhere I've never worked in before. And just being transparent and okay with not knowing everything can be really hard. But kind of chewing on that and allowing yourself to make mistakes and allowing yourself to ask for help, and just kind of being open with people in that, hey, this is not my typical wheelhouse, but I want to learn and I want to be good at this. And I do offer these skills, but I need some help in this other area. So having those conversations with coworkers and with your supervisor, I think can be really helpful with just learning quickly and being okay with not knowing everything.
Perfect. Okay, we're going to do one last question. I think this is an important question, because I think especially for people that are searching and for people that are open to like any and all institutions, I think we hear about this a lot in grad school, institutional fit. And I think all of us have kind of like touched on fit in some shape or form, either in regards to like the job or the supervisor, or just the values of the institution. So one of the pre-submitted questions was just asking about advice for like balancing multiple important factors. And this person says, I really don't jive with the values and priorities of my institution. How much should I risk sacrificing for institutional fit? So I guess the question is like, if you feel like you don't, like this person is saying, fit with the values of the institution, like how important is that? Do you all think that maybe there's different like functional areas that can fulfill this person's needs, or is like institutional fit kind of like the end all be all, and does that like trickle down everywhere? I have my own opinions on this, but I want you 3 to talk first.
I'll try to take a stab at this one. I felt like working at my previous institution, the mission and values, it really aligned with mine. And for me, it was easy to talk about that with students, with alumni, with faculty, or even strangers. And even to this day, even though I don't work at the institution, I'm the alum, I'm still talking about my institution, because you're essentially like the ambassador. So for me, it's funny being in my current role, because we talk about universities that we want to partner with, and my alma mater is one of them. And so for me, I think it's important that your values have to be in line, because that really impacts your day-to-day in your work, because it's really hard to try to promote something or, share something that's very passionate and close to your heart with others if you don't feel that way. I don't know, that's just for me personally. Like I think I would have a hard time trying to promote something that I just don't feel that tied to. That's just me.
I definitely agree. I think on the short term, you can probably get by in positions if you're like, maybe you don't align with what's going on kind of at the top level, but maybe down here, like what I'm doing. But I think on the long term, you're probably going to feel the burn and burnout if you constantly are upset with the way things are maybe running at the VP level, or like you said, priorities and values. So I think as you look to the long term, especially if you want to stay at that institution, and maybe in another functional area. If from the top down, they're not really supporting mission and values, I think on the long term, it's not going to be a good fit.
I agree. Everything was said. Okay, well, we only have a minute left, but I first just want to thank these three wonderful women for giving us their time and sharing their experiences and stories today. This was super insightful, and I feel like I learned something new from all of you. And Ebony, are we going to touch on some upcoming WISA-related items that we want the attendees to know about?
Yes, absolutely. So again, I echo Jordan's sentiments. Thank you so much for our panelists for bringing us some great personal experiences today. And we really hope that those who are on the webinar were able to take some notes. If you have additional questions that you were not able to get answered, you can contact us on our email account. We'd be more than happy to connect with you after this. And so I would like to say that WISA is having a drive-in conference. It's our 9th biannual conference. It's May 31st at IUPUI, and our call for programs and registration is now open. And so call for programs closes on March 8th. And so you can check the NASPA IV-E website, and the submission information is on there. And so I encourage you, if you are more than able, pass the message to your colleagues. We are looking for some new ways to engage with other women in the region and build some collaborative partnerships and relationships. And so again, our program submission deadline is open until March 8th, which is right before NASPA. And for those of you going to LA, some leadership team members from IV-E will be presenting on navigating difficult workspaces for mid-level women. And so if you are in LA, please be sure to come and visit us during that session. And so again, I thank everyone for your time. Be on the lookout for some things from WISA IV-E. We are excited and always looking to find new ways to engage with the region. We thank you for joining us today, and we want to wish everybody a happy rest of your day and happy rest of the week. Bye, all.